So he's in there. This is the sound of the snacks right away. It's 10 after the sessions.
It's when?
Actually, big rounds.
The only people in Jack was myself and John.
Even after I sent the reminder for the distribution.
I will repeatedly just myself to make
Just like this, it's a video reflex.
Yeah.
You don't want to sit up here for a few like.
I know Alex, Alex Clear, it's a risk.
Yeah, there's no comment so much. Yeah, like t-shirts. What, are these the same old dog t-shirts? No, these are every t-shirts. Oh, every one t-shirt. Yeah. But you have themselves. I do have themselves. Sounds like you learned.
I think we only have one on the agenda.
That's true.
A 10-minute discussion, maybe a little bit. Maybe cutting it a little short. More than that. And Steiner's presentation. will take another 10 minutes too.
Sure. It's a
Testing short.
Yeah, it's up to your team. Take one for the team.
And our illustrated practice.
It's out here to pass blue sheets and then
It's what?
we get t-shirts.
Yeah. Apocryphal. It's okay as long as you're taking minutes. Thank you, Nathan. Jabberscribe, anybody? It's not like we've got anybody in the room, and Jonathan has volunteered. Thank you. We'll get started here in another minute. I'm sorry?
I'll even come up and sit in the Jabberscribe seat.
We've actually got a short agenda today, so we're going to give people another minute or two to wander their way in.
Yeah, well, we room for power to go out.
We have lights.
I don't think lights are going to be the problem.
It didn't really occur to me, but there are a lot of meetings without windows, and apparently it got really dark. Except for a lot of times.
Clodo Canada was pitch black.
Did y'all keep going anyway?
I'm sorry?
Y'all keep going? Dogs stopped?
They all kind of paused, like physically stopped moving.
You don't want to run into anything?
Your guys are currently?
Time just to hit during SAG.
I mean, you definitely have to get going.
Like we had gotten through the first presentation and the power goes out. It's like,
Did Harold go up to the mic and say, "Go dark"?
No, he's going to go to the
yeah.
There were references made in this group regarding the NSA and stuff like that. Oh, I saw a lot of those on Twitter as well. That's reference specific.
You want to get started?
Yeah, I think we should probably go ahead and get started. I know there's a few more people that are going to be coming in, but go ahead and get it going. So, welcome everyone to Montreal NETVC session. Note well, this is the new one. Make sure you're well aware of it. Please declare any IPR that you're personally aware of. It doesn't have to be your own IPR. You're welcome to make third-party declarations as well. Yeah, for this working group in particular, where we're trying to have a royalty-free deliverable, it's critical. Blue sheets are going around. Probably need to go around again because a lot of people came in after they circulated. Please just keep them circulating. We have one note taker already, Nathan, right? Do we have a second? Anyone else? Any volunteer? I'll probably take some notes myself up here. All right, and we already have Jonathan as our Jabberscribe. Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, and Jonathan will actually be presenting remotely too. All right, so agenda bash. We have the room for 2 hours, but we're not going to need that. We currently have about an hour of the agenda scheduled. So we'll have update on our work group documents, the requirements and testing, and then we'll have updates on the Codex, XVC, and Thor AV1 comparisons. And then we need to have a discussion about what to do with the work group after all the codec candidates are are presented. Any other topics or adjustments that we need to make? All right, so the status of the work group, our milestones for the first 2 deliverables, the requirements and testing, are a little bit late, but they look like they're doable pretty soon. I think both documents will probably be ready for work group last call again, but we'll see after those presentations. The big problem is the last 3 milestones. The codec specification, reference implementation, and storage format. We do not have a single merge codec candidate that's been adopted yet, and we need to have a discussion about that following the presentations about what to do as a work group for this future work. So starting with requirements, Jose or Alexei are not on, right? Okay, so the requirements draft was a minor revision to add the profiles and adjust them to match some other industry fora that are using this document as input. So there's a definition of what bit depth and chroma subsampling formats are allowed in each profile. And we'll do a final, probably 2-week work group last call on that, starting probably at the end of this week, and close off that document and start the Shepherd write-up. So requirements pretty much done. On to testing. Thomas?
All right, I'm Tom Steady from Mozilla, and I have another update of the NetVC testing draft. Okay, sorry. Yep, Thomas Steady, NetVC testing draft. It's today. Next slide. So there's only one change to the testing draft since last time. I added a section on subjective tests. There was already a section on subjective tests, but I had to add a lot of more information. People complained that there was 2 different types of tests, pair comparison and the MOS score evaluation method, but no guidance on when to pick which, and also a lot of detail lacking. So what I did is I took the pair comparison test and expanded the section a lot. I gave actual criteria for evaluation. We can look at the next slide.
Is this the remote?
Oh, sorry, yeah. This is the last slide. There's one more slide, actually. Now I look at it. I did one. But yeah, we wrote the pair comparison section. We actually used a methodology in the pair comparison section. We used it to test the CDEF tool. This is an example of the results we got from one of the tests. So we've already made sure this methodology works. So this is basically what it produces. You'll get votes for one side, votes for the other side, and votes. I couldn't see a difference with images that are the same quality, or in this case, it was actually videos, because I added a section for videos as well. And you can see that there's a strong preference for one for the other. There's actually a way to compute. There's a rule that says how many votes you have to for it to be considered significant. For example, if you use the math in the subjective test section, the second, third, and fourth videos on this result page are considered significant, but the first and then fifth and sixth ones aren't. The colors are just for the color the parts of it. So red is voting for CDEF filter on, green is voting for the CDEF filter off, and then gray means you couldn't tell the difference between the two. So we gave the option for a tie button, basically. And then the next slide. There. Yeah, and then we added a guidance to use. Basically, we found that the MOS score in method was not very popular because it was really expensive to do. And secondly, because it's you're giving an absolute quality rating, you have to have a testing environment set up and have everyone go through this special environment. And that's basically really hard to do when you're relying on people's contributions. And, so the pair comparison is really nice because it's robust against different test setups. You can have a huge crowd of people do it basically on their laptops. And you're basically looking at relative differences. So the absolute test setup isn't as much of an issue. So that's basically all the changes I did to this draft. Pretty much nothing else was touched. I think there was a couple minor nits, but at this point it's basically done. So, any questions?
Adam Roach is area director. So you think the next steps on this is basically writing it up and asking for publication?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
So the chairs were planning to issue a last call right after, either after this meeting or before the end of this week.
Okay, any other comments? Good? Okay. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Next up is Jonathan. There we go.
Hello. Can you hear me?
And see you.
Oh, great. Perfect. Okay, so I will give an update on the XVC video codec and present especially what has happened since the last IETF meeting when it was presented for the first time. So we can look at the next slide, please. So I'll just give a short introduction to what XVC is and then just mention about the technology, but the focus of the presentation will be about what has happened since last meeting, news since IETF 101, and then I'll show the results and the results for the new royalty-free baseline profile of XVC, and that's basically, and then the conclusion is that XVC is considered a candidate for NetVC. So if we look at the next slide, please. So XVC is what we call a next generation video codec. We released the first version of it in September last year. And then just a few weeks ago, we released the second version of it. The compression performance of XVC is better than other available codecs. It's been developed by my company called Davidian. It's a software-defined open source video codec. There's also a commercial license available for it from Davidian. And we have a specific framework for dealing with the evolution of the codec, which I presented in more detail at the last meeting. So if you have access to those slides, you can look deeper into that. We've also focused quite much on making sure the decoder is running fast and the decoding complexity isn't too bad. So we have a JavaScript version of it which runs in real time at our web page, which you can check out. Next slide, please. So this is just a recap of the technology which is in XVC. There is quite a lot of similarity with conventional codecs such as AVC and HEVC, but we have built or we have included quite a few novel tools, which are some of them are listed in this list. And one important aspect of the XVC codec is that all of the coding tools are isolated within restriction flags, as we call it, which means we can control from the bit stream which coding tools are activated for a specific bit stream. So the decoder will know how to handle bit streams which are only using a subset of the coding tools. And next slide, please. So focusing on what has happened since the last IETF meeting, we have done some software improvements. We added multi-threaded encoding support based on picture level parallelism. So we're basically processing multiple pictures in parallel, which gives a good speed up factor. And a nice thing with it is that it's producing bit exact result as single threaded encoding. And then, as I mentioned, we released the second version of XVC. It has a little bit better performance than what we reported in the February meeting. We have improved the quantization coding. And then we also defined a royalty-free baseline profile, which is using a pure subset of the full XVC codec. So by disabling actually roughly 2/3 of the coding tools, we're just using 25 of these restriction flag controlled tools. So that gives worse performance, of course, but it also using a much smaller tool set. So that's why we are making it available royalty-free. And the source code is available with dual licensing, so there's LGPL or the commercial option. And we also submitted an IPR declaration to IETF for the XVC draft, which is royalty-free with reciprocity. Yes. Next slide, please.
Before we go, Moses,
Sure.
before Mike. So yeah, the royalty-free baseline profile was a interesting development. So that seems to be, making this much closer to the charter. But my major question is, how did you arrive at the subset of tools to define the royalty-free baseline, and what if any IPR vetting was done to have confidence in that?
So I mean, we have done a limited analysis of the IPR situation. We've focused more on finding a tool set of the basic tools which gives good performance and seem to be generally well known from a certain time back. But we haven't done a thorough IPR analysis. So it's more relying on our process for dealing with licensing issues when they arise. So if we would discover that there was actually someone having a patent on a tool which would not be able to provide it under royalty-free terms, then instead of using 25 tools, we would be using 24. So I mean, we would apply our framework for dealing with that.
Okay, so the tools that you disabled were just basically a rough stab at what you think is not going to impact the performance too much, and maybe new enough that it may have some IPR. You're not actually aware of any. It wasn't people coming to you and asking you to remove things per your process. It was you just deciding that these things may have IPR on them, and so you actively removed them.
Yes.
Okay.
So I mean, we've tried to find a good balance between the kind of the risk and the performance, and yeah, that's the state we ended up with, kind of. Thanks. It's a good question. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Yes. So these are the results that we presented in February. the performance has not changed almost anything on the full tool set. But on the next slide, we report results for the royalty-free baseline profile, and in this case, the royalty-free profile is the anchor. So we show how much do you gain from using the full tool set. And that is reported to be around 12.5%. And yeah, next slide, please.
You have something that shows your royalty-free baseline versus, I mean, I saw you have full XVC versus other codecs, then you have royalty-free baseline versus full XVC. Do you have the two composed? Do you have something that shows royalty-free baseline versus VP9 or AV1?
I didn't include it in the slides or in the updated draft, but we have published the results at this awcy.devidion.com, so you can pair the different configurations there. If you want to compare AV1 with the royalty-free baseline of XVC, for example, it's possible to do that. But in some sense, you can also derive from these numbers, from this slide and the previous slide, you can get a rough estimate of the distance between the different options. Yes, so maybe the next slide, yes. And this is just summarizing that we believe that XVC codec is a good candidate for meeting the NetVC objectives. That it's competitive performance, it's optimized for web applications, and we think the IPR situation is good, and that we have a good framework for approaching potential problems for it. And that's it. Thank you.
Any questions or comments?
Thomas Stady, Mozilla. I was just wondering if I was looking at the code base and I couldn't find the baseline profile. Is that currently implemented in the reference encoder?
Yes, it is. You should be able to just run with minus profile and set it to 1 instead of 0.
Oh, okay, thanks.
It's added quite recently, so if just like last week or something.
Okay, that's probably why I didn't see it. Thanks.
No problem.
Mosinati from the floor mic again. The JavaScript version of the decoder that you have on your demo page, can you give a little bit more detail about how that was developed? Is it using WebAssembly? Is it using Emscripten, or what did you do? Did you use the reference code itself, or did you write something new in JavaScript?
It's based on the reference code. It's using Emscripten to convert the C++ version to JavaScript.
Okay, and you're not using ASM.js or WebAssembly currently?
No. Well, yeah, ASM.js. Yes.
Okay, so you're using the old version, ASM.js. Okay, the reason I ask is because I think in Steiner's presentation there's also some discussion about whether this may be practical for modern codecs, and it seems like your performance shows that it is. Can you decode high resolution like 1080p in your current JavaScript decoder?
I mean, what we have on our webpage is 360p because that's what we believe is safe to demonstrate. It runs on all PCs and so on. But I don't think in general you would be able to do 1080p with that version, because that's what we have so far is a single thread version of the decoder. You might want to do multi-threading if you want to do 1080p.
Okay.
Well, if there's no other comments, thank you. And we'll move on to Steiner.
And so, Jonathan, please stick around because after all the after Steiner's presentation, we're going to discuss what we want to do with all the codecs. And so, if you're waiting for a decision about whether or not to accept XBC as a candidate, we'll do that after
Perfect.
Steiner's talk.
Thanks.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'll touch on Thor, XVC. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, there you go.
It's very directional, so yeah, like that.
Okay, I'll try. I'll touch on Thor, XVC, and AV1. So starting with Thor, there have been no bitstreams changes since the last meeting. Not for the last 2 meetings, I think. But there have been a few updates in the GitHub repository, all of them related to the Intrinsics library. So I've added the optimizations for ARM v8, the 64-bit ARM processor. I have some various minor SIMD improvements for both x86 and ARM, also some new intrinsics added, which improves performance slightly. There is also one bug fix, which caused incorrect Thor behavior on ARM. And also there are various fixes to remove warnings and errors generated by some compilers when compiling Thor. So still missing in Thor, the most important at least, is the DALA entropy coder. And there are likely still some bugs, probably most of them in the decoder. I'm pretty sure that it's possible to generate an illegal stream and make the decoder crash. I'll elaborate slightly on the SIMD library, do a quick recap on what that is. So Thor is not using the intrinsics instructions directly. It's instead using a library. And the idea is that it enables an implementer to write SIMD optimized code once for all architectures and compilers. And all the low-level compiler-specific code can be hidden in that directory. And if we want support for a new architecture for the codec, we'll simply add support for that in the library, and the actual codec code can remain unchanged. So these intrinsics are generic and easy to implement on most architectures, which also means that intrinsics that are very specific for one architecture and difficult to replicate on others are avoided. So the final assembly may not always be optimal, but it's usually good enough. And also the limited support for the highly specialized intrinsics in the library forces the codec implementer to write code that runs reasonably well on all architectures. And then, as Mo mentioned, there's something called WebAssembly, which has some similarities in that it offers an instruction set with generic instructions, which can be easily implemented on different architectures, but it hasn't support for SIMD. I think there are a couple of projects aiming to do that, but I'm not sure if those are going anywhere. But anyway, if there is SIMD support in WebAssembly, it should be straightforward to port intrinsics library in Thor to that, and with that support, a few new possibilities, interesting possibilities open up. So it means that the decoder itself can be transmitted with a bitstream and run at near native speed in browsers. And that allows quick deployments of codec changes. Specifically, IPR issues can be addressed quickly. So I'm just bringing this up. This is not a formal proposal that we should do something like this. And I think also adding SIMD support is outside the scope of this group. So basically just asking for your opinion if you have comments. I have more slides, so just interrupt me at any time.
John, thanks. I mean, the one thing I'd say is probably it's worth sending the list of SIMD instructions you want to the people doing the WebAssembly projects, because obviously this is probably a pretty comprehensive set of the things that are useful, so they know that, they presumably need to know what people actually would use if they defined it. So
yeah, actually the SIMD library in Thor could be used as a guidance for doing that. But did you know if anybody is actually working on it, or perhaps Tim?
I would suggest asking some of the guy behind me who
Right.
works for a browser vendor.
Yeah, Tim Terrier from Mozilla. Yes, WebAssembly people are working on SIMD. I don't know any more than that, but I can put you in touch with the right people.
Okay. Do you know if that is focusing on floats or integer, or both?
I think it will address both, but it may address like 32-bit integers only, which may be less useful than you might like.
Right.
Um,
Suspecting that.
Yeah. The question I had is if you're targeting a WebAssembly target in a browser, what role does standardization actually play there beyond the standardization of WebAssembly itself?
I didn't get that.
I mean, if you're going to make a codec that you're going to change on the fly as you see fit, then what would be the point of standardizing it in a working group like this?
Well, you would perhaps standardize how you do it by sending that bytecode.
So the chairs have had some discussions about this point, along with the AD. We've definitely reached consensus that the majority of the work would not be done here for something like that. The only open question is whether or not some kind of umbrella work needs to happen somewhere, because if you just have the bits and pieces of this sharded across a lot of different SDOs, not just work groups, but clearly some things would need to be done in ECMA, some things would need to be done in W3C, but it'd be hard to do all of those without some kind of coordination or some kind of umbrella effort. So the only work to be done is really binding all of this up, defining the primitives and then also binding it up, communication to browser APIs, talking to RTP, RTCP feedback, all of those things. So there'll be a lot of binding work in some parts of IETF to be done. But what NetVC could do is very vague, if anything.
I think that probably not just me, but a lot of people would be interested in seeing something a little bit less vague. And I suspect what might happen is that you actually need a different charter than the one that NetVC has. So
it's definitely not in charter in the current charter.
Exactly.
Okay, I'll move on. I've done some comparisons. I've compared XVC versus the royalty-free configuration of XVC, which was also what Jonathan did. But I was using a different test set, not RB-compressed set, because I didn't have access to a server with the XVC enabled. So I've been using what I used to benchmark Thor with before we had RB-compressed yet. And the test set consists of 8 sequences, 10 seconds each, compared to 1 second for RB-compressed yet, and 4 QP values and bit rates. I also compared the royalty-free configuration of XVC with Thor. Thought that would be interesting to see. And I've been using the high latency settings, single pass. These are the actual configurations, just for reference and for reproducibility. Okay, these are the old slides, I think. Did you get?
Make sure this is version 02.
Did you get? Do you have it? I have it on the
Yeah,
memstick.
it's uploaded. It's uploaded. It just It was pulled up. Sorry, too soon.
Yeah, well, I started the runs more than 2 weeks ago, and they actually finished 2 hours ago.
Good timing.
Yeah, good. Okay, these are the results that I got. I was using speed mode 1 for precisely because speed mode 0 was just too slow. So obviously, the default configuration of XVC is here the anchor, and I'm comparing with the royalty-free. And obviously, there is a BDR loss, which is fairly consistent across the streams. I got a bitrate reduction of a bitrate increase of 14.7%. Jonathan had 12.5, but since this is a different test sets and 10-second clips instead of 1 second and so on, I think these results are consistent with what Johnson presented. I also tried speed mode 2, and I get a similar result, 13.8% bitrate increase. So it confirms what Jonathan has presented.
Just real quick on that. Jonathan, can you confirm what you were using speed mode 0, I believe, for your tests, or were you using were you using the same speed modes that Steiner's presenting here? I assumed you were using maximum compression.
Yeah, we used speed mode 0 for our report.
So that may be another set.
Yeah, that could also explain it. But again, different sequences, so you get different results. And then I used Thor as the anchor, the slowest setting in Thor, the high efficiency mode, and compared that with the royalty-free configuration of XVC. And then I managed to get results for speed mode 0, which runs, in this case, 6 times slower than Thor. So all the 8 sequences, XVC produced better results for 7 of them. On average, I got a bitrate reduction of 13.6%. So in the case of the one sequence, which was slightly worse with XVC, the only thing special about that one is that it's pretty noisy. It was recorded with a pretty noisy camera. I'm not sure if that's the explanation, but could be. Then I also tried with speed mode 0 using the same anchor, but then Thor and XVC have pretty much the same complexity. And again, XVC performs better for 7 of the 8 sequences, and on average 8.5% better. And even if the Dala entropy coder is added, I still think XVC royalty-free will perform better. I also did speed mode 2, and in that case, Thor was better in average, but then again, XVC is running 3 times faster. Also I had a quick look at the code-base complexity, defined as simply the number of lines of code. XVC has about 25,000 lines of code, which is quite similar to what Thor has, depending on whether you include the SIMD code or not. XVC doesn't have SIMD, I think. But if we compare that with AV1, the numbers are quite low. AV1 has something like 7 or 8 times the number of lines, which for the most part I think is unnecessary. But I think it would be very hard to make a complete implementation of AV1 with fewer lines of code than XVC and Thor. So finally, a quick update on AV1. The spec is frozen. I said that at the last meeting, but then I included quotes for frozen. This time I left them out, so it's supposed to be Stable? No, we'll see. But there have been changes since the last meeting. So if we compare VP9 with AV1, the bitrate reduction of the latest code is now between 31 and 34%, depending on what metric you use. And the encoding time is 150 times that of VP9, which I don't think really tells the complexity of AV1. But, well, the reference encoder is not very mature yet. I definitely think it's possible to make that number go down quite a bit. So finally, looking at the compression history, I've updated that to the latest code. Compression-wise, AV1 is basically the same as in March, less than 1% BDR improvement since the last meeting, but it runs twice as fast. And this is with low delay configuration. So if we move on to the graph, so we have on the y-axis the negative BDR and the date on the x-axis, and you can see that since March the performance is basically the same. There's this big spike in mid-February, but that was obviously a bug, so we can ignore that. Looking at the complexity, the graph is finally turning, so it's at least going in the right direction now. But this is frames per minute on the y-axis, so there's still some distance to make the reference encoder practical. But it's definitely possible to achieve a real-time performance with AV1, but then of course with some compression cost. Oh, yeah, that was what I had. Any more questions, comments?
I have one question, Stina.
Sure.
Just for clarification, when you compare the XVC and Thor, was that was with the royalty-free profile?
Yeah,
of it?
that was with the 51 tools disabled as specified in the draft.
Okay.
No other changes.
And just one comment on the SIMD. There is a little bit of SIMD in XVC as well. When it comes to interpolation filtering, for example,
Okay.
we have a little, just as a comment.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Any other questions? So I think the important takeaway from this to me is that in the last meeting, we asked the XVC proponents to look at our charter and come up with a royalty-free baseline, and they did that. And we asked them about what the relative performance to Thor would be, because the Thor team believed that the work they had done was taking IPR into account and not as an afterthought. And it seems that both the XVC and Thor folks are in agreement that that the performance is either equivalent or better for XVC, royalty-free baseline, versus Thor. So at least Steiner's cross-check seems to indicate that there's a speed mode where they're almost equivalent, and there's about an 8.5% bit rate savings. So the net of it is that the technical requirements are being met. The real question is, what is the IPR story around this RF baseline? And is it something that the work group is comfortable with, or is it something that needs a lot more thought? And you know, I want to get a sense of the room of what people think about doing this IPR effort as you know, something just since the last meeting and not from the ground up when the codec started, and without any deep analysis of the IPR during design.
Tim Terry from Mozilla. Well, I thank you guys for taking the effort to create the royalty-free baseline. I think the level of analysis that's been done, the situation is still basically the same as last time. There are a lot of details here, and the details matter. And unless you really spend time reviewing all those, as I'm sure Mo knows from all his Thor work, it's very difficult to have any degree of confidence that something is truly royalty-free.
Any other views on this?
Adam Roach is an individual, and I share Tim's concerns.
And Mosinati, I was speaking as an individual. I think I also share some of the same concerns. Speaking for the work that was done in the Thor team, not the majority of the effort, but certainly a large chunk of the effort was, getting the IPR story right. So, if we had spent all that time on technical progress instead, we probably could have made a much better codec. But so I have some concerns about, short-circuiting the IPR analysis effort, into a few weeks, compressing it down to one meeting cycle. I think that wouldn't give me a lot of confidence about whether or not this would have challenges if IETF published it as a royalty-free standard and implementers, browsers shipped it and then, had to face challenges. I wouldn't have a good comfort feeling about that at this point.
Yeah, and just want to add, like to give some people an idea of the level of effort that was applied here, just on the Mozilla side, I think we can estimate the amount of time we spent on IPR review for AV1 was in the order of man-years, right? And there were, of course, plenty of other people in the Alliance who were also contributing efforts in addition to the lawyers that we hired. So, this really does take a lot of effort to get right.
Okay, so okay, so the only other agenda item was to talk about what we want to do as a work group, what future directions we want to take. So I think Jonathan has done a good job of answering the questions that we had back in March. He's come up with a good technical proposal that has very good performance. The real question is whether or not the work group believes that the IPR story is sound enough to adopt the work. And let me first recap with the other candidates. So we started off this work group with two candidates early on, Thor and Dala. Both of those teams have stopped active development on those. There's been a little bit of work on Thor that Steiner summarized, but it's largely stalled because both of those teams have been contributing actively to AV1. And the goal originally was that that work may end up here in this work group, but that's now controlled by a separate forum that will not be publishing that and certainly has not sent any signals to this work group that there'll be any effort to publish that here. So while those two teams are working in a different group, in a different forum, there won't be anything to progress here in NetVC for either Dala or Thor. So that really only leaves XVC as a candidate. And the IPR story for XVC doesn't have enough confidence from enough people in the room. Unless others want to stand up and say something contrary, I've only heard three opinions, and all three were low confidence about deploying this and having it be truly royalty free. So that leaves us with a dilemma here in the work group about what to do. We clearly don't have a candidate to meet the last 3 milestones. So I'd like to hear if there's any ideas from anyone of what direction we should take. And if not, we're probably going to pause the work group to see what happens in the industry with AV1 and some other initiatives that are happening in other groups like MPEG, and see if there's a need to resume later. But if we don't have any direct work to progress now, there's probably not a need to meet in the next meeting cycle.
Adam Roach as an individual. So I also want to speak to, you were speaking to sort of the technical ability to come up with a candidate we'd be able to publish. I think there's a much, much larger meta question about whether, given that AV1 will be out in the market soon, it would be a net good or a net bad to put something else out that claimed to have effectively the same properties in terms of IPR and performance. I'm of the position that that would be bad for the market. And so, although I'm sad about the way that things played out, I'm sad that the way that AV1 was developed was not in a more open organization like the IETF. I think the fact that it has finished with the support of a significant portion of the industry means that even if we could publish a codec in here, it wouldn't be a good thing.
So any other opinions on this? So Adam's basic comment was we don't want to fragment the royalty-free market. Is that pretty much what others in the room feel too?
Steve Bosco from Polycom, I would agree with that.
Yeah, Tim Terry, pretty much +1.
Does anyone feel that we should be progressing a candidate without waiting for what happens in the market with AV1 or any other efforts? So I'm surprised Jonathan is not saying yes.
No, I mean, we are happy to contribute with XVC, and if there is an interest in it. But I mean, we're not pushing for something which wouldn't be. I mean, we want to work collaboratively around it. So if there isn't interest around it, I don't see a point in kind of pushing for it.
Adam Roach, and again, speaking as an individual and sort of outside the charter of this working group, I think the work that y'all have done in terms of getting this to work in JavaScript is very interesting. This is unfortunately the wrong venue to do anything other than maybe a little bit of work around the edges. And I would encourage you to continue to do that sort of work. As Mo points out, that's probably something that is more usefully aimed at either getting and sort of socializing an open source library around that, and or if you need additional work inside web browsers working with the W3C to have those APIs defined. There's probably some additional very small bits of work around it to figure out how to send payloads that contain JavaScript defined codecs, because you don't really have the knobs that you would want to sort of tweak that. Receiving is harder. Right. I mean, so there are going to be little knobs here and there that you have to do on like WebRTC to get this to work accurately in browsers if you want real time, and around I'm blanking on the name of the structure, the audio and video graph stuff that we have inside web browsers to make it work for non-real time. So I mean, so there would be a lot of work to do there, and I think it would be very interesting. It's just most of it is not IETF work.
Good point. Thanks.
Okay, so with that, it looks like we will be pausing. Now, this pause would happen after we, essentially what would happen next is we would issue last calls for the requirements and testing documents, and then send those along to the IESG, assuming there's no big qualms within this working group for those. And then from there, we would pause for roughly 6 months to see where things go. So that would mean the mailing list would stay active, but no more physical meetings. Wouldn't try to schedule time unless something really came up.
6 months isn't a unit number of IETF meetings?
Let's call it two cycles.
Okay.
We'll definitely not meet in November, and we'll probably give guidance well before that. We probably will not meet in March, and make a decision about July closer to that. And again, what we're waiting for is to see if there's any clarity in the market around AB1 or MPEG's parallel efforts, to see if there's a need for continuing work or if there's a clear candidate that's emerging in the market.
All right. Well, that is everything we had on the agenda. So unless there's anything else somebody wants to talk about, we would be adjourned. Going once? Twice? Okay, looks like we're done. Thank you, everybody.
See you in 6 months or never.
If you have the blue sheets by you, bring them up. If you haven't signed them, please come up to sign them.
Please make sure to sign them because we circulated them very early and a lot more people came in.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. We're gonna close up now.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Oh.
If anybody is interested in additional swag, go see Nathan.
Yes, there's a lot of things. Yeah.
Does it
Certainly,
cue the next?
I know that there's
Doesn't.
the logic for
Just refresh that.
our logic for how you do skipping forward and macking and concealment.
That was
a lot of edge.
Yeah.
I'd love to learn this browser, Cindy.
Yeah, and
multi-threading.
happy that you should. And there's
Or something like that.
Workers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like you could certainly imagine a generic API where you just pull
I
out
do a couple of
I'm sorry?
some set of control systems that control that.
Send out the announcement
Yeah.
for hotspot, right? That's true, we gotta do that. Then we do a write-up.
One is why.
I was gonna ask for the reverse.
Thought you could wrap your hands around Thomas a lot easier than Alexa in Moscow.
Probably.
Yeah, I mean, that's never gonna happen again. That was one of the biggest mistakes. I mean, the start of Active Directory shutting down.
One way or another.
API.